Let me begin by saying what an honor and a privilege it is to be here today, and to thank all of those who made it possible for the expert group on archival description to meet in Rome. I say the following not because I'm pandering to the audience, but I frequently say to friends and colleagues that Italy is my favorite place on earth to visit, because for me it is a feast for the eyes, a feast for the mind, and not to be left out, a feast for the stomach. I think I speak on behalf of the other members of EGAD that it is a pleasure to stay over and to be able to participate and have this opportunity to speak to you. The only reservation any of us have with respect to that is we just spent the last 3 days very intensively thinking, analyzing, discussing, and we would all agree at the end of every day that we were thoroughly exhausted. And after 3 days of thoroughly exhausting ourselves, it's safe to say we're all thoroughly exhausted. But we will do our best to bring up a bit more energy in order to present. So essentially what I'm going to do, the first part of this is I think it's a bit of just giving you context, which of course, when I say the word context, I always say it with a certain amount of irony because I'm giving you context for records and context. So the experts group on archival description was formed by the ICA Program Commission in late 2012. And it was the partial successor to the Committee on Best Practices and Standards, which was, I think, through various permutations beginning in about 1992, responsible for developing the existing ICA description standards. It's before my time, although Stefano and other members of EGAD all go back, and there's some continuity to the past and our current activities. The first term for the experts group in archival description was 2012 to 2016, and ended with the publication of the draft conceptual model. And we're now, I have it as an open date 2016, but I think it's safe to say that our current work, as you'll see later in my presentation, will come to a conclusion in 2020. And it's probably important to say when we say conclusion, is it will come to a provisional conclusion, which is to say it's inevitable that we as a community will continue to revisit, revise, rethink, develop our understanding, respond to the environment that presents us with both opportunities and challenges. But that's who we are, and that's roughly the time frame within which we work. And it's safe to say that following 2020, the experts group will probably continue to operate into the foreseeable future. What we're currently charged with doing is developing a conceptual model for archival description, and broadly stated, based on the four current ICA description standards. And doing that, using modeling techniques that were not available during the earlier development, or perhaps were not as employed as much as they could have been earlier. Just reviewing the existing ICA standards and the dates in which they were developed. Principles upon which the ICA standards were developed began as in a discussion in Canada in 1988. In over a 2-year period, they developed these into principles for ICA, which then became the foundation for developing ISAT or ISAT-G, which we know it better by. And though while ISAT-G was in development, they were already thinking of ICAR, International Standard Archival Authority Records. And those were the first two standards developed over a 5-year period. And then both of them were revised late in the 1990s and early in this century. And then along came two others shortly after, ISDF and ISDIA, one for describing functions and the other for describing archival institutions with holdings. I'll return to those standards in a moment, not in a great deal of detail. And I apologize for this slide, it's a bit packed with information. Since what we're working on is we're looking at it as archival description. And while we're looking towards the future, we very much wanted to ensure that we respect the past. And there must be a way of getting from where we are now into the future. So, among other things, we, without fear, though with some concern, we revisited the fundamental principle of provenance and its two particular parts, which I'm not, everyone here knows them extremely well. And we decided in the discussion amongst the group that we all, in a most basic sense, in a fundamental sense, agree on the principles, though with differences in culture, linguistic environments, context. They're all interpreted in slightly different ways. And so we came to the conclusion that ultimately what captured that basic understanding and consensus was that we wanted to describe records in context, and that the doing of that, putting records into context, does respect the fundamental principle of provenance. Along the way, though, we've also wanted to take into consideration the large amount of scholarly critique, as well as not just theoretical critique, but practical critique arising out of the archival community of concern for the traditional understanding of provenance, of the respect to forms and the respect for original order. And we wanted to take a more expansive, more open view of what provenance means. probably do not, well, maybe I will repeat this because it's important, to say that fundamentally what we recognize is that the people that create, manage, accumulate, use records do not exist in isolation, but in complex layers of interrelated, interdependent contexts. And I add below that, through time, to add another level of complexity to it. And that to describe records and to try to preserve that context so the records can, can be understood through time is an extremely complex challenge. And that what we fundamentally have to understand is that we can never do it perfectly, we can never do it completely, nor can we do it from all possible perspectives. But that we do have a fundamental responsibility within our capacity to do so, to try to describe records in context and preserve that context. And to do so while always basing that description and that preservation of context on evidence. I think I'll move through this a little quickly. Is this part of what I'm saying is, in a certain sense, is we're in the midst of revising this understanding of archival description. And this sort of professional revisiting and reconsidering of how we go about doing our jobs and fulfilling our responsibilities is something that the archival communities, the archives have done, and professionals have done. And it's also replicated in other communities. Libraries do this, is constantly revisiting, adjusting, looking at new challenges, new opportunities. And the same would be true of museums. But if we look at that pattern of revisiting and reimagining going on, that there's one thing that's constantly present is what might have been in the past a sort of undifferentiated sense of description where it's all contained in a single apparatus is to analysis of this and a separation of this in order to create more flexible, more economic ways of describing. And always wanting to fulfill the fundamental objective of opening up, enabling new tools, of new ways of finding, discovering, and understanding of records, based on being able to take the different parts of description and configure them together in different ways, which allows these different perspectives to take place. And so the 4 ICA standards, I would argue, follow that trend. So first they started with ICAD, which intertwined everything together. And then they started isolating certain parts of what was all contained with ICAD G. But they never quite got there for a variety of reasons, part of which was that the standards were developed in a sequence, and they were never looked at all at the same time, that they never looked clearly at how you would relate all of those components to form archival description. So of the 4 standards, really, I said, G is the only one that got significant uptake or use around the world, and it's been quite successful. ICAR a little less so, and ISDF and ISDF practically none at all. So a bit more context is when I talk about challenges and I talk about opportunity, is if we look at the technology, on one hand, it is presenting us with, I think it's safe to say, a frightening challenge. This is like maybe the favorite metaphorical word using the explosion of electronic records, the sheer quantity of them, and the sheer complexity of them presents us with a challenge of how in the world are we going to manage that and fulfill our responsibility as archivists. Now that I've brought that horrible, frightening challenge up in front of you, I suggest let's forget about it for a moment, because I want to talk about the technology also presents us with opportunity. The computer and network technology presents us with ever new forms of representing our information, ever new ways of facilitating that, taking a part of our description into pieces and interrelating them to form new expressions of description. And so I mentioned markup technologies, which are very good at doing hierarchies, which is why many archivists love them. Love it. And database technologies, SQL. And then most recently, the emergence of graph technologies, which allow us to make more complex networks of interrelations. So those present us with opportunities. And it's sort of within that context, EGAD is trying to reimagine and rethink what archival description can be, while trying to also maintain due respect for the past at the same time. So what we're working on as a group are 3 products. One, the conceptual model, which has consumed most of our time to date. And you can think of this as really identifying the components of the key entities, as we've called them, of archival description. What are the characteristics or attributes of those entities that make them uniquely what they are? And finally, how are they related among themselves to fully describe records in context? The next product that we're working on is a formal ontology. It's based on the conceptual model, but it will go beyond it, much further beyond it in detail, necessarily. And this to provide a foundation for archives to be able to participate in the so-called semantic web, and to be able to collaborate and interrelate with allied cultural heritage institutions, in particular the library community and the museum community. But I would also say that the the emerging digital humanities community as well. And then finally, and this has not gotten very much attention at all, is we will develop application guidelines. And the intention behind these is to provide practical advice or suggestions on how would you put RIC into practice? How would you describe based on RIC, but also how would you put in place the systems that will be needed to support this description? Systems that mask a lot of the complexity, that make the describing as efficient as possible. So you don't have to have 3 years of training in information technologies in order to describe. We know that's not a terribly practical expectation. So we need to be able to lay the groundwork for this to be practically implemented, and it's going to require us to, for tools to be developed. Excuse me. Okay, so again, a retrospective look back and focusing on, I said, G, and all of this being a setup to not fully describe what we have presented in the conceptual model and what we're still continuing to work on. But the most prevalent kind of description of an archives is centered around the idea of the phones and then a hierarchical description. So that, the finding aid. There are alternatives to this. There are people doing other things that are not quite that, using relational databases and drifting away from hierarchy as such. But that is the predominant conception. And it is very much that was what is modeled in ICAR G. And I think it's important to say that this is a form of description that in a certain way, when it looks at Holmes, it sees it as a sealed in thing, and the description is more inward looking, and it doesn't recognize what we think is a very basic and fundamental fact, and that phones and the records contained within it also are related in myriad ways outside of that to records in other phones, and on and on and on and on. I'll come back to that because I have a phrase for that more expansive understanding. So one of the pivotal changes that we've made within RIC is, in ICAR G, it was primarily focused around aggregations of records. So you start at the top, and then you subdivide your aggregations into smaller aggregations, and those into smaller aggregations, built into a hierarchy. It didn't say much about individual records at all. It really thinks about aggregations. And so what dawned on us within EGAD is, an individual record and an aggregation of record, or a set of records, as we're calling it, are not exactly the same kind of thing. They differ in very fundamental ways. And when one is describing an aggregation or a set of records, the elements of the description, while they might resemble what you would use for describing an individual record, they don't mean exactly the same thing. And so, for example, if we talk about the creator of a record, we're probably thinking, you know, the author of a record. But if we say the creator of a phones, we're not talking about who created all those records. We're talking about who or what was the entity around which that body of records gathered. And so recognizing that seemed really important to us because it helped to clarify, and we thought would help archivists to describe better when they're moving from one kind of object to another kind of object. And it's important to point out here is that given the way that we're approaching this, is that the record might be in this set of records right now, and then some rearrangement and rethinking takes place, and it might end up in this set over here. Or, in fact, it may, at one and the same time, exist in more than one set. And over the course of its history, you know, other perspectives come in, say a scholarly perspective, someone doing research. They might, in fact, pull records from this phone zone, this phone zone, this phone zone, and create their own sets from a completely different perspective, so that the records participate in the environment that the archivist provides for it based on archival principles, but at the same time, other perspectives could be applied to it. So, traditionally, we've used multi-level description, a kind of graph, to describe aggregations of records in a hierarchy. And what's important is that when you do that, at least from a practical point of view, if you're using a strict hierarchical approach to it, is that a record can only exist in one set and not in more than one. So, partly what we envision, the archival description envisioned by us, is we're seeing the records and the people and the activities that people engage in, the goals that people are trying to achieve is really the fundamental entities that we're interested in as archivists, and that we interrelate all of them with one another is essentially we're envisioning archival description as a vast social document network. Now, I have a few more minutes, so I did something rather risky, which was, as the chair of the group, I didn't take minutes for the last 3 days. I did spend a lot of time on a flip chart, writing things down, which we've saved. Gavin McCarthy from Australia back there has the flip charts all saved as a partial record that we have a lot of notes. But I got up early this morning and from memory which is a hazardous thing to do, jotted down a few highlights. So we spent a good portion of the discussion refining our understanding of the role and nature of the three products and trying to say, what's the strategy with respect to each one of them. Definitely reformulating the plan of presentation for the conceptual model, because one of the clear things that we got from the public comments was not everybody, but we confused quite a few people that they had trouble seeing the forest because the presentation seemed to be just a whole bunch of trees. So we rethought the strategy of how to better present that so people could see, work from an overview down into the model. We spent a lot of time discussing the methodology for deciding what is not an entity. We spent an enormous amount of time discussing words like, is entity the best word or not the best word? And is it an attribute or is it a property or is it a characteristic? What should we call it? And it's a really difficult thing because every one of these words is used in a variety of communities. And in fact, between the conceptual model and the ontology, we had our own internal conflict over what was the meaning of a word. So it's really not easy to do. And then so we spent an enormous amount of time squabbling, that's not right, discussing that. And then issues if an entity is one of the major significant objects of interest for archivists, what are the characteristics of each one or its attributes that make it what it is and uniquely what it is? And then, and some things we say about a record, is there are inherent traits in it, and they will persist with that record through time. And there are other things we want to say about the record is that, it was in this state. It was like this for this period of time. And then some records managers, some archival processor came along and did something. And now this is part of the history and a change of state, say, for a particular entity. We did a lot of reevaluation of what were the most significant things. Where should the archivists focus their attention? And then what are the other entities that exist that are secondary, that are there in order to help us to describe those primary entities? So rather than just giving them a long, undifferentiated list, we made some decisions about what's fundamental, what's there to help us describe the other, and so on. So just to give you a sense of this, instead of a flat list of 14 things, we actually ended up introducing new entities. So it's more than 14 now, but we think that actually clarifies things. So you can think of three things that we're fundamentally interested in. It's an archival resource, and we're using that for the time being as an umbrella term to say that it's record, in aggregations of record or record sets, and also the notion of a record part, which would allow an analysis of a record. Its parts, whether they're intellectual or physical. Under agent, we have the individual person, and then we have the notion of a group, and under that, we will most certainly formally present family and corporate body, but make it understood that group could also be extended to be other kinds of groups. So, for example, you hold a national election, and the people go out and vote, and all of the people that went out and vote constitute a group, the people that went out and voted on that day. And we talk about the fact that this person elected has a mandate now and grants them authority. So if we wanted to do something like that, we think that could be accommodated. Okay. And then we also have this entity called a position, which is, I think, best understood as the intersection between an individual and a group. And it is a kind of identity. And then finally, we have the notion of a delegate agent. And somehow, the wisdom of including this in the original conceptual model seems to me that confirmation that we needed is evident in the newspapers every day when they're talking about bots that are unleashed on the internet that go around and do things like try to influence your opinion, or in fact even organize meetings, and it's not a person at all doing this. And then finally, we took the notion of function, which we had restrictively defined it in terms of purpose or goal, and we've sort of reverted back to the broader understanding of function that was presented in ISDA and is more prevalent in the literature in terms of how it's defined. So it includes, you know, the fancy philosophical term for this is it's teleological, which is to say we're looking at those activities that are performed towards the goal, that they have a purpose behind them. And so we're looking at as function as both purpose, objective, and the activities that are conducted in realizing it. And then we're specifically saying under that are three entities: goal, and I'm not sure we'll stick with goal, objective, purpose, there's a variety of words we can play with there. Activity, so what is it that we do in fulfilling that objective or goal? And then transaction, what are the individual discrete acts that we engage in, that when you bring a bunch of them together constitute an activity, etc. Then we isolated off what we consider certain supporting entities, and among them isolated a particular group of them. And I use here the word, I say optimally maintained as controlled terms of values, because, you know, in some ways many of these local institutions, or maybe within, you know, national standards of description, they may already be controlled, but we're audacious enough within EGAD to imagine a world in which we might have global collaboration in maintaining such a terminology, you know, such term lists, but humble enough to know that it probably would take a long time and a lot of effort to build up the support to do something like that. But occupation, function as a concept, so as an abstract one that frequently comes up in the discussion is management of water, which, of course, in Rome has a wonderful history of how water has been managed in Rome, going back to Roman times. But water management's practiced all over the world, and in every place that it's practiced, it has its own particular history and nuances. And so that's the idea behind having a conceptual list. Okay. Record classification. So classification schemes that exist all over the place. And documentary form. Place and date we're going to treat as distinct entities in their own right that need to be addressed individually with respect in their own, each in its own domain. Names and identifiers we're going to separate off and treat in a very specific way. And then relations between the various entities will itself be a kind of entity. Okay, so finally, since I've gone over time, is we're going to work towards having a second draft of the conceptual model for public comments early in 2018, as early as possible in 2018. The ontology, an incomplete beta draft in early 2018 as well. We're not really going to turn our attention to practical advice because we need to get the other things sufficiently stable before investing a great deal of time in providing practical guidance. But we intend to have a first draft for public comments of application guidelines in early 2019. And then after that, since we're iterating, we ask for comments and feedback, and it's impossible to know what the feedback will be and what quantity and how complicated. After that, the timeline is kind of, we'll wait and see and then determine how quickly we can turn it around again. But the absolute objective is we want to have all three products to be complete and relatively stable late in 2020 before the next Congress of ICA. And then, thank you.